Hey guys, as we get ready for the upcoming election, there's a lot of thoughts happening from a lot of voices, a lot of outlets, even social media, where people are a little concerned about the election process and even some thoughts about the Electoral College. So let's back up for a little bit, because in the history of our nation, if we back up when the Constitution was done, George Washington as the president, elections did look a little different in early America, a little different than they do now. So how did elections really come about? What was that really like? How has it changed over time? And we'll get into the Electoral College here in just a second. But let's back up to elections. What has changed now from what it used to be back then?
When you look at elections changing overall, the process really is what's changed the most, because the Constitution, even back then, said that every state can determine the time, manner, and place of elections, how they occur. Also different is the way we choose candidates, because there were no parties at the time of George Washington. There were kind of factions that were out there, but
different
no
groups
parties.
Of people. These are our boys, those are your boys, whatever it was. And parties did come around pretty quickly, but with George Washington in the beginning, he was actually elected unanimously.
Yeah, very, very different from anything we've had since then. We've had no unanimous elections where there was only one candidate and nobody else ran. That was George Washington.
Although I think, was it James Monroe who was really close to being elected unanimously?
James Monroe had unanimous. There were other candidates, but he was the unanimous choice. And one elector said, no, I don't want, I'm going to cast my vote against you, because I think George Washington should be the only unanimously chosen president in America's history. So James Monroe was very close, but one vote against him.
And by unanimous, that was from the Electoral College. So the votes from the Electoral College, which again, we'll get into more of that in just a second. But this is where, so Washington was elected unanimously from the Electoral College, ran unopposed, which again, weird thought to think of today, but political factions weren't quite as big. And then after Washington, when you have the John Adams and Jefferson battles and debates, and then you get to the John Quincy Adams and the Andrew Jackson battles and debates, so parties certainly form. But even back then, it still was different. Today, we have primaries, you have parties, and the parties have primaries, and they choose the leader from their party, and then those leaders battle it out. And even back in early America, when you went to the ballot box, you didn't have a list of names that you're choosing from. That's even changed.
That's changed a lot, because back in the early days, time of the Founding Fathers, you went in with a blank ballot and said, of all the people I know, who do I want to be governor? And they could have chosen Tim governor. He didn't know he was running, but if that enough people, so everything was essentially a write-in, if you will, because you just wrote in the names, they counted the names, said, hey, they want you to be mayor. I didn't know I was running. Well, you're the one they chose. So that was the way it went, but they got into ballots fairly early. And again, as you go to the states, even look at today, we have states that have primaries. We have states that have jungle primaries. The primaries you choose before the general election. On general election day, you will have a choice. But a jungle primary says, well, like Louisiana does, on election day, we don't know who wins. We just know who the top two are. Then they'll have another election after election day. You also have the difference with some states like Utah doing 100% mail-in ballots. Other states like Alabama is, no, we don't want mail-ins. You all show up on election day. We might let you have an absentee if you're going to be gone. So it is so different the way it handles the times, how many hours you can vote in a day, where you go to vote. Everything's decided by the state. So it really is very different from state to state, and it was very different back then as well.
And if we think of contentious elections, which certainly we are in an era where there's contentious elections, if you go back to Abraham Lincoln, for example, there were some contentious issues happening in the nation. We actually have a poll book from back in the Lincoln era when the nation is voting to determine who's going to be the president. This is a poll book that was used going out to military individuals, because if you are, let's say, from Pennsylvania, but you're now fighting in the Civil War, you might not be in Pennsylvania that you can vote. So they would send these official poll books out, sometimes to where the military was stationed, and this way guys from Pennsylvania, they could cast their vote. And so again, elections have changed a bit over time. Even the absentee ballot idea, not a brand new idea.
It's interesting that back then Lincoln was hated by the Democrats, and New York at that time was a Democrat state. And New York, and this is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania supported Lincoln very strongly, but New York didn't. And so New York also came up with a plan on how to vote in the field, and they called it absentee voting. And so what they did was they sent guys from the state out to get the votes of New York soldiers in the field. and they came back, and it turns out there was massive fraud. This is a book that was done in 1915 on all the prosecutions and trials of New York, trying to get all these fraudulent votes that they would cast in the name of soldiers, but they would vote for the Democrat president, which was McClellan back then. They didn't want Lincoln back in. So voter fraud is not a new thing either. I mean, just like there's different ways of voting, and New York was kind of a leader in voting fraud back in the day.
It's interesting. They have been some changes in New York, but not everything's changed in New York apparently. So this is something that as we look at elections, certainly things have changed over time where states have the power and authority to control how they're going to run elections in their state. But one of the things that so often people talk about is that we're a democracy, which of course we're not a democracy. We're a constitutional republic. We are a republic because we choose our leaders to represent us. A democracy would be where every one of us would vote on every single issue, or we would have the opportunity to. Well, we're not in Washington, D.C. vote on every issue. We elect leaders to represent us. That's a Republican form of government. And those leaders are bound by the Constitution. That's the law of the land. So we are a constitutional republic. But still the argument is when it comes to a presidential election is the vote should not be factored in by the Electoral College. It should be the popular vote. And the Electoral College was something the Founding Fathers did.
And this goes to the fact that we're not only a constitutional republic, we're also a federal republic. And a federal republic means levels of government. We are a constitutional republic in that we have a constitution that represents all the people, but we're a federal republic in that we have states that also represent at the federal level. So you have, for example, the U.S. Senate, which is made up of states where that a little bitty state like Rhode Island has the same strength as a huge state like California. But over in the House, as a constitutional republic, there's more people in California, so they have a louder voice in the House than the people of Rhode Island, a much smaller state. So we're a constitutional republic and a federal republic, and the question is, how do you get the voice of the states to be heard at the same time the voice of the people's being heard? And that's where the Electoral College is so brilliant.
Yeah, so really brilliant idea. Going back, you can go and do a little research from the Constitutional Convention. You can see some of the debates that took place leading into the idea of the Electoral College, and some noted founding fathers, a Roger Sherman, a James Wilson, different guys who were involved in some of these ideas where this was really birthed and came from. But what they said is we want to make sure that it's not just you're winning the majority of the votes of the big cities, because back then there were 13 colonies or 13 states, and there were 4 states that had the majority of the population, and the smaller states said, we're afraid that we're never going to have a voice. We're not going to matter. We want to be a part of the process of choosing these leaders. And so they came up with the Electoral College saying that every state will be delegated a portion of, in this case, votes based on population, but also based on their senators. And so everybody has a voice in what happens, and so you're not just winning the vote of the big cities. You actually have to include the whole nation, and this is something as we look at the nation today, there's a lot of cities in the nation, but there's a couple of really big cities in the nation.
And even going back to that day, they debated at the convention that there's enough population of 4 states to outvote the other 9 states. And so we small 9 states might never get a president because you 4 states could say, well, let's rotate it among us. Today, there are 7 states in the United States that have such large population, they could choose the president for all the other 43. 43 would have no voice because the 7 could outvote them. And so that was the concern they had. And how do you change that? How do you do that? How do you deal with that? That's where they said, okay, we want to have a majority of the people, or a quasi-majority. We want a large portion of the people, and we want a large portion of the states. So the states get a voice, the people get a voice, which, as you said, the cities. Today, there are 3,800 cities in the United States. 20 cities in the United States have enough population to be able to choose the president of the United States. So if you want to be president, if you only had to have the popular vote, you would just go up the East Coast, come down the West Coast, you're done.
Maybe throw in Chicago.
Yeah,
right?
Chicago, that's right.
Maybe Houston, maybe San Antonio, but if you look at the major cities, the Los Angeles, the Miami, the New York City, Chicago's, there's enough population in these major cities that the rest of the nation wouldn't matter. And the Founding Fathers were wise enough to say that you shouldn't just win the big cities, you also need to win some states and the population of those states. So the Electoral College really is a good deal. And the reason we bring this up, as we come toward election time, there's always a conversation about, well, the popular vote, the Electoral College, and all this stuff that goes on. What you need to know is the Founding Fathers very brilliantly thought this out very well. And it doesn't mean we can't have a conversation or debate it. And if we even want to change it, we can, because you can have constitutional amendments. That's how you change the Constitution. But under the Constitution, this is the way the system works. And in the midst of everything going on, what we can tell you is that even though it's not based on a popular vote, it is based on the Electoral College. that is actually a very beneficial thing for the majority of Americans, because that means in your state you can make a very big difference if you get involved and if you vote. And this is where we want to encourage you. If you have not voted yet, make sure you get out and vote, and hopefully by now you're already registered. If not, you can correct that for the next election. Make sure you register to vote so that you are able to vote and have your voice be heard, because part of how the Electoral College works is those electoral votes are assigned based on the winner of the state.
And let me add to that, when you vote on an election, what you're voting for is how your state is going to vote. When you choose whether it be Trump or Biden, you're not choosing the national president in that sense. You're choosing how your state is going to vote for which candidate they want. So your vote at the state level really is the voice of your state in the presidential election, not a national voice that you have with all the other people. You know, we're in Texas. Our voice doesn't join with that of California and New York. Our voice joins to say, here's who Texas votes for as a state. And that's what the Electoral College is all about, is deciding how the states will vote.
The most important thing is that you show up and vote. Let your voice be heard. There's a lot of people very frustrated with the way the world, or specifically America, politics are operating right now. You can't complain if you're going to be part of the solution. Make sure you get involved and vote. If you haven't voted yet, on Election Day, show up and let your voice be heard.